Well, I've never done this before, so forgive me. This is just a slight review of my relatively long career. I guess I've been working with metal for just about 50 years, maybe a little longer. My first real direction came when I was accepted as a resident blacksmith at Peters Valley in '73. I chose, for whatever reasons, I'm not formally trained, and most of my training has been worked with a couple of people. I spent many summers at Penland absorbing what I could. Mostly it's been, I'm like an autodidact, and if I need to know something, I do my homework, I read, I figure it out. I've always been a pain in the neck, and, and from 6 months old, it's never changed. My experience at Peters Valley, it was bicentennial year, and I started doing weather vanes. Actually, the image on the right of the screen, that's the first vane I ever did, which was just flat, very traditional construction. Then I started getting into hollow forms like the pig. And this one that looks that's a moray eel. And I did for probably 15 years after I left Peters Valley, moved to Pittsburgh. Moved to the Penland community in North Carolina. And even beyond that, I continued for almost 15, maybe 20 years doing weather vanes. Finally got burned out on it. I've always, I consider myself a smith, but not necessarily a blacksmith. I work in all metals, gold, silver, copper, learning process, inventing tools, making tools. There's no real chronology from here out, but this is a teapot that I did for, there was a gallery in Pittsburgh that had annual teapot shows, open media. And this was my most minimalist teapot, sort of a wire frame, just bent steel wire, TIG welded together. I had always had sort of an interest and fascination with hollowware, so I spent about 3 years really working hard at it and using Japanese tools and methods. These are some smaller vessels. The small cups are whiskey cup size. Very labor intensive. Not very financially rewarding, but I was dedicated to it. I wanted to learn how to do it. I wanted to get some level of mastery of the process. These two are done, one's copper, the right-hand one was actually in brass, and the silvery coating on it is, I flooded silver solder onto the partially completed forms, and then sort of filed and scraped back through to reveal sort of the textures. About 12 years ago, I had a fire in my studio, and it sort of stopped me dead in my tracks. And my studio wasn't destroyed, but the building around it was, and I was really left in the lurch. And providentially, I was offered a position with a high-tech company that does 3D metal printing, located outside of Pittsburgh. And they needed someone with my kind of finishing and metal coloring skills. And I blurted out some large number that I wanted for pay, and they said, sounds good. I went, sounds good. And so I've been with them. Now I am on, I guess you'd call it a furlough now. So my fate with that company is, it's a mystery right now. But at any rate, the X1 company designs, builds, and operates very expensive 3D printing machinery that specifically works with metal. The time there allowed me to play with some really interesting materials. I was the resident artist, sort of. They never knew what, they never gave me a true job description. And I sort of functioned throughout the company wherever I could help. These two images are samples of metals that have gone through a vacuum furnace. And, you know, I'm always fascinated by structure, texture, and I've never seen anything like that. And these are things that, you know, they typically throw in the garbage can. But for me, it's like, I'm like a pack rat or a crow, you know, and anything shiny or a texture, a shape, you know, I grab. And my shop is like above my nose with crazy materials and bits and shells and animal bone. And because I had access to, I never took this particular project very far, but the objects on the right are the part that's imprinted with dark matter and my name. That was like a little badge size cup 3D printed. And the flip side, these textures are created, the powdered metal that they use is magnetic. So I mixed up a slurry with like a air drying binder, affected the metal, like the little Woolly Willy toy, you know, where magnetic particles will stand up and respond to a magnet. When it air dried, those pieces, it froze that magnetic field. It was like hairspray that was holding it together. That went back into the furnace and it sinters and solidifies. The little skulls in there were from a skull that I carved for my kid who was doing a Hamlet soliloquy. And we 3D scanned the skull and then shrunk the image size and 3D printed tiny little skulls, which I embedded in the matrix. I wouldn't have the opportunity. I've got millions of dollars worth of materials and equipment. It's a pretty interesting situation to find myself, an untrained artist, with access to that. This quote from Moby Dick really kind of fits me to a T. If people that come to my studio, it's like overwhelming. And but I feel like I make order out of disorder. And these are some images from the Carey furnace. Some of you are familiar with that. It's a historic site in Pennsylvania, outside on the outskirts of Pittsburgh. And I'm involved with some of the iron casting and some of the events that goes on there. I'm fascinated by the size, shape, texture, almost the disorder, that larger image of some of the ductwork. I mean, it doesn't look like it makes any sense at all, but it produces 1,000 tons of iron a day. This is another view, Carey furnace. This main stack was was over 100 feet tall. They've chopped it down, and I've taken some of the shards that I'm sort of reworking. We'll get to that in a minute. The next group of images, the hollowware work I did, as much as I love doing it, it's not a very practical way for me at my age and my output to think that I can support myself. It's extremely labor intensive. For years and years, I'd always work making tools to make the thing that was in my head. Very labor intensive, very time consuming. I've collected bits and scrap pieces from the X1 company. These are either rejected parts or 3D printing like appliances that are used to produce other parts. And I've collected like probably near a ton. And out of boredom one day, I just started composing pieces and realized that this was what I'd been working towards since I started working metal. It's like, I've got enough skills now that I can draw on everything I've ever done or learned and just freely compose things. So these are not terribly large. I guess in some ways they're maquettes, even though I think they're strong enough to stand on their own. These are about, 18 inches, fit within an 18-inch cube. A lot of these things are sort of sprues and just cast off parts that I'm repurposing, reassembling. So it's kind of extremely high tech. That's all these bits and pieces are 3D printed. But I just manipulate them, take them apart, tear them up and recompose them and weld them all together. It's a very immediate way of working, which is kind of thrilling to me. It's when all of these are coming from the same place. And you can see most of these shapes are from the output of the 3D printer. But they're otherwise thrown in a dumpster and recycled. So they don't seem to bitch too much when I go home with a couple 100 pounds of scrap metal. That's about where I am now. I'm up in the blacksmith shop right now. This piece that I'm working on, I just started yesterday. That's actually a shard from the stack from Carry Furnace. Something old, something new. And I'm looking forward to a sunnier, brighter future here. So carry on. Thank you.
Who's going to be next, Dan? All right. What?
Oh, nice. That's your head?
All right.
Okay, I didn't know if that was like a fountain image. That's awesome. When was that? Do you have that currently?
It only lasts for about a week.
Nice.
No, my barber, you should go check out Glen.
Where at?
He's on Penn Avenue right near Iron City Bikes.
Oh, I usually get a Scooter, it's brown.
Yeah, Scooter used to work for him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Time Bomb shop right next to Scooters. The guy that owns that, Rick, he's been like my graffiti dad.
Yeah.
All right, Diane, just give me a minute here. We'll get it.
And
Well, I got friendly with Ryan. There was an event in the studio was.
yeah.
And he had a single chair set up.
Oh, nice.
And it was right outside my studio, so he cut my hair down.
Awesome.
Is the right one, Dan?
Yep.
All right,
That's it.
cool. Diane, you can see it, right?
Yes.
All right. And here's this. And here is Dan Tomczyk. Yay!
This button. Okay. Like Dean, stand over here. Hello. Let me take this down. I look like I'm wearing a. So my name is Dan Tomczyk. I work here at Touchstone Center for Crafts. This place has absolutely changed my life. I've been an intern, and now I work here as staff. this journey kind of started through being the person that I was in this image in 2011 and just kind of like living out of my car, traveling around. My goal at that point in life was nothing that had to do with art. It was to see how many different places I can go, live, and just like experience life. This summer, I hit 44 states in terms of traveling, staying, kind of like setting up a home, whether that be in a geo-tracker or like a campsite somewhere where you can stay for 14 days. I was also in college at this point, going to school for gen ed studies, trying to figure out what I was after. I was going to California University of Pennsylvania, and while attending that school, I kind of like understood that, all right, I guess I found that community is something that brought me from the run-of-the-mill pizza shop to pottery where I'm at today. But I do both. I probably spend way more time on pizza, actually. It's my primary source of income outside of Touchstone. Moving forward, these are just some random pizzas I've made over the years. I figured this would be okay to put in here due to the fact that we've all just had lunch, and hopefully only the folks watching from Zoom are the folks hungry right now. Over the years, from 14 on, I kind of scored a job at a pizza shop. They never asked how old I was, and they hired me. I was paid cash, like I'm sure all of you were for your first jobs, and it lasted for years. Some of my friends there had an 18th birthday party for me, and my boss was like, "You're 18 now?" And without those people in my life at that point, I don't know if I would have maybe found this community love or like anything like Touchstone. So I always like look back to that and realize that that was the first time I felt like a family or like brother, sister type relationships with people outside of my own family. I think the last few images coming up here, pizzas that were made here with Ed, probably last season or the season before, about maybe two seasons ago here, I kind of realized that as much as I love working here and making pottery, I truly feel that my community goal, or I guess like my job in terms of being a part of the community that I live in the north side of Pittsburgh, is to continue feeding the people of Pittsburgh. So I'm gonna keep making pots and working here, but eventually my goal is to open up a shop and continue to do this kind of thing, probably with less meat, but if people want the meat, we'll have good options. So moving away from pizza, this is another thing that came to me later. So in 2006, at 14, I started making pizzas. In 2000, I think 14 was the first summer that I'd come to Touchstone Center for Crafts. I was like an impromptu intern. There was a few interns that summer that had left by the time I had visited my friend in ceramics, and there was just kind of space for me to like hop in and become an intern for the rest of the season, and Steph really helped with that. At the end of that season, going back to California University, I was already like into making pots at school. I had declared my major. My professor had basically like taken me in as a son and been like, you know, Dan, I know what you're up to, and you're clearly not just focusing on this course. You're here to either make friends or party or meet girls, and that's just not what my class is gonna be. So I suggest you either fail, drop out, or focus. I chose the third option and kind of clean slated my life at that point, and never had revisited just the things that I sometimes still think about being childish and not regretful, but you all know what I mean. So wood firing came to me that season, and Dan Kuhn, who is a Pittsburgh potter, taught a workshop here, and my friend Sam, who was the tech in ceramics at the time, and I were privileged enough to get a scholarship to take Dan's course. So we were like kind of like the studio assistants, but also students. And the community aspect around this wood kiln, like without standing here and crying about it, has fully changed my path. I sat around that night with folks who still fire here, but you know, some of them, the oldest person in our group was like 82. And the youngest person in our group was probably myself, I believe. And everybody was like sharing stories of their life, relating, talking about pretty much everything outside of the kiln while we were like focusing on firing. So I left here and went to do an apprenticeship at Baltimore Clay Works. This is not working. I don't want to touch your computer. Sorry. So in 2014, Dan Kuhn and a few other folks basically pushed Sam and I to either graduate college and go on to be apprentices, or to search for residencies where you can learn wood firing. And I really was attracted to the apprenticeship approach of whether it be pizza or pottery. So I immediately looked where I can go and learn how to wood fire the fastest. And down at Baltimore Clay Works, they fire weekly, which is insane. Like 40 hours a week as an apprentice, and then 40 hours a week working to feed myself in Baltimore. But it was 9 months of doing this, stacking pots precariously in the kiln, and then having them come out and it being like Christmas Day. That's a terrible unload picture. There's like collapse. But so through watching this happen weekly and learning incredibly quickly about wood firing, I realized that I wanted to take the program that was at Baltimore Clay Works that would work with everyone from high schools to colleges to community pottery studios, or to just people renting the kiln out. And we took these people in like they were not only students, but sort of family as well. And we all fired together, shared our stories, and continued to create a love for that like community aspect of wood firing. There was a weird situation at Baltimore Clay Works that led us to essentially not be able to fire as apprentices anymore. The other apprentice that was with me amazingly took on the responsibility of being in charge of the kiln. I kind of took on the responsibility of being his sidekick / I guess apprentice. We were kind of like in it together. And I started making more work like this. Previously to this, I was making all gas-fired glazed work. I really didn't have a relationship to the surfaces that I was gaining from my pots to my life and what inspires me. And through wood firing, I found that the rusty surfaces of Pittsburgh and the dilapidation of the factories left behind, the colors that come naturally from burning wood, it was the closest I ever felt to being full circle and from what attracts me to what I'm producing. And with the functional wear aspect of it, it almost felt like pizza to me. So it was like you could hand it to somebody and they can walk away with it. And like they may decide that it's really bad cheese or it's a really bad surface, but like they're going to take it home and think about it and appreciate it. And that's always been important. So leaving Clayworks, I had gone on to do my last internship at Watershed Center for Ceramic Arts up in Maine. And I worked very closely with the studio manager there. And he like absolutely pushed me to come back to Touchstone and kind of like pitch the idea of a studio manager here. Not that we haven't had it in the past, but luckily in 2016, there wasn't a studio manager here. So through trial and error and a little residency after Watershed here, Shauna had agreed, and Steph and I guess the office came to the conclusion to bring me on as Dennis, the previous maintenance person, but also as a studio manager. And I've had the time to also build this community of wood firers here that this place kind of needed. Our kiln really wasn't being fired other than for workshops. There's a group it's called the Ellis School. It's traditionally the Ellis School for girls. It's a Pittsburgh, kind of like prestigious almost. I believe it's private, but it's also funded program where, I mean, these kids, here's a group of them there. God, they're into it. It's super cool. But so they come every year and they fire with us. That's their professor. And then there's Meg and I cheesing. But like, so their pots come out and these kids are like, I don't know what Christmas is like at all of their houses, but they just like, they grab these pots and they're like way more stoked than I could ever be beyond seeing it. Like that, I get the stoked feeling that they get when they touch their pots. So that's kind of what I'm after. And this I put in here because, so that's like 6 a.m. after like 48 hours of standing by this kiln, sharing stories. And that looks dangerous, right? Like if you showed that to the craft school insurance company, they'd be like, who is in charge of this disaster? But that's controlled. And it's been a long journey to figure out how to control that. So since 2014, at my first firing, I've been a part of and been like a part leader in 50 plus firings now. And the majority of them have been here. And hopefully we can keep churning. So moving forward, I'd like to talk about less of my work and more of what is inspiring me. And the current movement that is going on right now has been important in my life. I have lived in the city. I've lived in the suburbs. I lived in Wharton Township. I went to 8 schools before 6th grade. I was homeschooled on 2 different occasions. I saw my stepdad get arrested. I moved out of my mom's house into my dad's house. It was crazy. But through seeing like people being active and standing up for what they believe in has really helped me. And then also being faced with the situation of being put into different communities and having to find your place there, whether it be in East Liberty and then moving to the suburbs where it's primarily well off and mostly whitewashed. So in any place I feel like I go, it feels that my job has been to like find my place there. And this has been something that I've been like following heavily and hope that the time is now. Another thing that inspires me is just like nature and how it can kind of take back what we've done. This is a stack of the wood that we fire. They're primarily hardwoods. This is from a lumber yard up the way. They would take this lumber, they say no to it. It goes to a big incinerator on their property, and they sell it to us incredibly cheap. It's great wood. And when I took them some pots from our kiln, they were like, what? You're doing this with our scrap? So it's really cool to be able to like use something that was scrap to fire a kiln. Firing a wood kiln is not the best thing for the environment, but when we're recycling things, it feels a little better to be pushing off smoke for 45 hours. This is a train. I spend, oh my God, probably 20 hours a week, no matter if I'm working here in the summer when I'm unemployed, in the winter, in train yards, practicing social distancing. I've become a pro at social distancing over the past 12 years, being in large train facilities, walking around and taking photos of old marks like this. Nothing that I'm showing you here is anything that I've done. These are just things that I've found inspiring. But this little situation here is called Moniker Art. It's been going on trains since pre-Great Depression and the hobos. And beyond trains, which I could talk about for a month, more things that are inspiring are family. That's Lemon, and that's Meg eating a burrito. And this is the work that I'm working on right now, which is also a big inspiration to me. Meg and I bought a house in 2017 in the North Side. And I'll be honest, like I've never done foundation work on anything. So we've been like tackling this cheap little house and turning it around one step at a time. And the things you see when you start taking apart a house are absolutely incredible. And this is not that I've put pottery on the side, but when you realize that your house is going to sink into the earth if you don't start digging it out, pottery has to take a back step. I'm privileged enough to have this job and be able to focus like this in the spring before I get here with some saved money. But like this weekend, I'm going home and putting siding up on this thing. So it's going to be good. So that's what it looks like now. This is where the rot was. And that's Ed, my roommate, and the chef here's old bedroom. He used to sleep where that piece of plywood is laying, and that was his walk-in closet. Eventually, it will be back together, better than it looks. It's not open right now, I swear, but it sure doesn't look appealing from the street. And yeah, as we continue on through the weeks, I just hope that everybody does their part. So that's it. Oh, you want me to stand in myself?
I'll do it. Stacy, you want to go next? All right. which one was yours? All right. All right, next up we have Stacy Larson.
Hi everyone, I'm Stacy Larson. I'm originally from Minnesota. And when, I guess it started out when I was in grade school, I was always like, I started making jewelry. And I thought that's what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. And then in high school, I started taking ceramics classes, and I wanted to just go to school for jewelry, but I always had ceramics in the back of my head. So I made sure whatever school I chose that they had a ceramics program. So I started by going to Syracuse University for jewelry. I love the Victorian era, so a lot of my work is influenced by that. Here's a couple pieces that I made using silver. And then I also took ceramic classes. So this was one of my hand building classes, and I was doing a series of sea creatures. And then in one of my hand building classes, we had to do a self-portrait. So I did a self-portrait of myself as if I was in the Victorian era, like in 1860s. So I was referencing the clothing and the hairstyle from the time period. This was undergraduate wheel throwing class. So I kept taking ceramic classes, and like, I think it was the beginning of my junior year, I decided to add ceramics as a minor. And then the next semester, I was thinking, you know what? I like ceramics a whole lot better. I guess jewelry can be my real job and ceramics can be my, you know, what I want to do. And then I was like, no, that's totally wrong. So I ended up adding it as a second major. So I have a double major in jewelry and ceramics. People kept saying, why don't you combine your ceramics and your jewelry? So finally in my senior year, I made a series of Victorian jewelry boxes with matching necklaces. So here's the first two, and this is the third one I did. And this is also when I started adding cubic zirconia to my ceramic work and actually firing the cubic zirconia, which is a man-made stone, into the ceramics. And I don't know if anybody's ever done it before, but I'm still doing it. Because in jewelry, you can take certain stones that can withstand high temperatures. So I thought, well, if you can cast this stone in place, what happens if you put it in a kiln up to 2,300 degrees? And it worked. So I've been playing around with that since, testing out different colors. Some colors hold and some don't. And then right after my junior year, once I had gotten into the ceramics community, which was absolutely amazing at Syracuse, I applied to go to Chautauqua. They had a scholarship available. So I was able to go here for an 8-week intensive in ceramics. And here I met a ton of great ceramic artists. Every week or 2 weeks, we would have 2 new ceramic artists come in, and they would work with us and give us feedback, critiques, give us like different readings to do. And it was great. I met so many great mentors there. Paul Donnelly, he was helping me with my forms. I was working a lot of vase forms, just thinking about proportions and everything. So that was my exploration with the vases on the top there. And then playing around with different flora and fauna. I didn't do a whole lot with the leaves, I guess, but it's fun to explore. I guess I'm kind of revisiting that right now in the studio. Also through Syracuse, I ended up applying to go on the Jingdezhen China trip. And they only send one person a year for 3 weeks during winter break. And I was excited that they selected me my senior year, because usually it's a grad student that's selected and they go. But so I was pretty excited about that. So I ended up flying into Shanghai. So these are a couple pictures there. The Shanghai Art Museum was awesome. I think I had 4 hours that I could spend there, and I started out in ceramics, and their collection is huge and amazing. And then I left like 30 minutes to look through the rest of the museum, which included like the ivory carvings, calligraphy, and all that other stuff, which is equally as awesome, but I wish I had more time. And then Jingdezhen is the porcelain capital of the world. So there's so much ceramics going on like in the streets and different shops. And it's really quite amazing. And every part of the process is done by different people. So you'll see people throwing the pieces, other people trimming, and then there's always like someone in the street with a cart of pots bringing them over to the kiln. Another person glazes it, and then there's decal shops too. Then you have the people who do the overglaze painting, and a lot of times they'll reference these books. So you can see down in the corner of this piece here, there's one of the books. They have like traditional sort of painting styles. There's also professional carvers, and this was at the Big Pot Factory. So there's a ton of giant pots here, and like the detail is amazing. This is a blue and white painting. It's so detailed, it's crazy. And their kilns are huge. So while I was there, I took 3 different workshops. I took traditional Chinese carving, I took an overglaze painting class, and a blue and white painting class. I'd say for the most part, the carving has influenced my work. I still do a lot of that. Then I graduated from Syracuse, and then I was looking for other opportunities I could do, and I found the Craftsman House, which is like a cafe, gallery, and they have a small ceramic studio in St. Petersburg, Florida. So I ended up living in St. Petersburg for a year. And for some reason, I always wanted to do ice cream sundae glasses. So I thought, okay, this is a great time to like explore and do whatever I want. I don't have any like specific projects I have to do for school. So I just did whatever, and it was great. And then after that, I found Touchstone. This was 2014, and I was hired as an intern here. It was the best time ever. And this is some of the work I made while I was here my first year. And then after that, I went back home, and I had been working at a bakery like off and on during school. I started working there in 2012, and I think I've worked there every year since at some point. And so I went back and I was working over the winter, which I hadn't done before. Usually it's just during the summers. And they offered like a couple small like cake decorating classes. And one of them I took was using fondant. And so this is a cake that I made. I think this was my second fondant cake. And I entered it into a competition. It was like a national conference that was in Minnesota. And I got silver on that. But it's kind of crazy how similar fondant is, and these gum paste flowers, how similar it is to clay. It's not as workable. Like you can't add water. It just turns like gummy, and it's almost like raising a vessel out of silver. You have to like coax the pieces. You start out with a flat roll, and you have to coax it around the sides of the cake to like flatten it out so you don't get any ripples. So it's a weird combination of like ceramics and jewelry. And then I also had access to a ceramics studio. My dad, he owns a computer repair shop, and he had a customer come in. She was a stained glass artist, but she also had a small area in her studio for ceramics. And somehow they got to talking about me, and she said she'd love to have me in her studio. So the next couple winters, I was able to actually make ceramics while being at home working at the bakery. So I would start at the bakery at 4 a.m., work until noon, then drive to the studio and work there for a few hours, then go home, make dinner for my family, and then go to bed by 8 so I could do the same thing again. So I started, right now is when I started feeling like I was going more the direction I wanted to go. I was revisiting the Victorian era, and I also started like putting flowers on my work, and I returned to using the cubic zirconia again. And it's interesting how working at the bakery and making those gum paste flowers, it was very similar to my work in ceramics and the direction I was heading. And I also started piping on these leaves and the tendrils on my work using the cake decorating techniques. And then I returned to Touchstone for my second year as the Student Affairs and Gallery Coordinator. And I also taught my first 5-day workshop. So these are my students. Then I was accepted to a post-bac program at LSU for ceramics, and that was really great. I was so glad I got back into academia because then I had access to peers and faculty that could give critiques and feedback, and my work changed drastically, which was great. So when I first got there, I started making these vessels that had like the flowers applied to the surface or the leaves. And then someone mentioned during like the first critique saying, why not make your forms reference the shape of like the flower plant that you're looking at? And that changed everything. So I also started looking at the Victorian language of flowers, and just like looking at the relationship between what the flowers mean compared to what the flower or the fruit was used for. So I started doing a series of different decanters and things based with alcohol. And this piece is a gin decanter. And so gin is made from juniper berries. And so I also started making some Victorian botanical illustrations to go with each piece. So here I was referencing, let's see, can you see the cursor? It's like this form right here. And then I made, this was a certain like gin sling or Pim's cup. They would usually put borage flowers as decoration on the top of the drinks. This is an absinthe fountain. An absinthe is made from wormwood, which is a pretty bitter plant. I also love whiskey, so I thought I'd make a whiskey set. And also, since I was down in Baton Rouge at that time, there's a lot of sugarcane fields. And one of my fellow students, they live on a sugarcane farm, and she actually brought in a stock of sugarcane for me to reference while I was making this set. And this is for rum. Then I started, I don't know, going in a little bit of a different direction and kind of looking at different flowers and just seeing how I could incorporate that into the form of the piece. And then I returned to Touchstone for a third summer. And then my work went a little bit differently. I started adding dewdrops to my work. What's this version? And then this past winter, I was lucky enough to get an internship at the Anderson Ranch out in Colorado, in Snowmass. So this is the studio that I worked at, the Long Studio. And then the third day I got there, it was like the beginning of October, it snowed, and then the snow never left, so. Also made into the Aspen Times a couple of times. And then their aspen trees are gorgeous out there. So I was inspired by the aspen trees and I started making some cups and tumblers. I also made an eggnog set. This is based on nutmeg, which is one of the popular spices that is in eggnog. We also had a few visiting artists, which were great. We had Simone Lee, her work is in the top left. Rose Simpson, her work is on the right. I'm gonna grab some water. And then we also had, shoot, what's his name? He's a Japanese potter and he's the 13th generation. His family is considered national living treasure of Japan. So that was pretty crazy. And he's got a great long lasting relationship with the ranch. So he comes there like twice every year just to make pots. We also fired the Noborigama kiln there. That was a lot of fun. It was like a 3-day firing. And then during the winter, they would have a few different groups of residents come in. They've got a bunch of different studios there, painting, printmaking, woodworking, ceramic, sculpture. So that was really great having these residents come in. We had a group that came in for 10 weeks in the fall, and then we had a 5-week one in the beginning of the winter. And then we were gonna have another 5-week one come in, but then that's when COVID hit and it got in the area. And then we decided that they wouldn't be coming. Then the next day, the interns were told, you guys have to leave by Monday, so see ya. So I went home, and it was really great being home during the spring because then I could see all the flowers that were blooming. So I was taking a lot of pictures. So I'll be around campus and I'll be taking pictures, so don't mind me. Then I came back to Touchstone, and this is what I'm currently working on in the studio. I decided to make some coffee pour-overs inspired by different flowers. So the one in the bottom here is inspired by the tulip poplar tree. And then the other one is an iris. So I might need you guys to help try out some coffee pour-overs and see how they work. And then I've been accepted to West Virginia University for this fall for an MFA program. So that's where I'll be heading next. And at least it's only 40 minutes from here, so I'll be pretty close.
Mac, you want to go next?
Stacy, do you know what age you first started?
All right. And yours is Touchstone intern presentation? No. Mac slides. All right, next up we have Mckenna Henriksen.
Oh, they can see us too?
All
right, fancy. Great. Hi, my name is Mckenna Henriksen. I also go by Mac. My pronouns are she, her, and they, them. I was the blacksmithing assistant intern last summer and happy to be here as the tech this season. I grew up in the Pacific Northwest in the 90s in the era of Twin Peaks, which dressing up since the age of 1 as the log lady. I grew up in a little town that was like smaller than Twin Peaks and possibly stranger as well. It's on a tiny island in the northwest corner of Washington, right on the border of Canada, called Lopez Island. And I also grew up part-time on site at a summer camp on an even smaller island, even closer to Canada, called Johns Island. My parents were the directors of a program called Camp Nor'Wester that does 2 4-week sessions for kids 8 through 16. and it's been in operation since the 30s and became a nonprofit in the late 90s. That was the place where I was really fortunate to be introduced to a lot of different crafts. The craft shop program there has ceramics, woodworking, printmaking, textiles, painting, drawing, a bunch of different mediums, and a heavy focus on Northwest Coast Indigenous art education as well, which was really fascinating. Even with all of the opportunities to try little bits of different crafts here and there, it took me quite a while to consider that as an avenue for my professional trajectory. But even through my childhood, I played around with making in a lot of different ways. One of which was on my own body, lots of making my own clothing, different hairstyles. I did a little bit of seamstressing and just for personal use. I worked at a restaurant where I got to play around with a lot of different types of food and recipe development. And this is a 2 foot by 3 foot chocolate crab cake for a birthday party. I made a lot of costumes. I still make costumes. This is the most recent one. It's a tardigrade or a water bear. It's like a microscopic animal that is essentially indestructible. I almost brought it, but it's like the size of a small couch, so I couldn't fit it in the car. I went to college from 2006 to 2011, and during that time I started going to Burning Man as well in 2009, 10, 11, and 13. And at one point in 2011, I contributed to a show that it was, there were artists nationally and internationally that all contributed to, I think, 99 different dioramas all in a row in the desert called Tiny Tropolis. They were little worlds within those little boxes. And in true Burning Man fashion, I do not have any photos of mine, and it was burned at the end of the week. So, but that was a really great project. The college where I went was called Fairhaven, and it's an interdisciplinary college within a larger traditional university in Bellingham, Washington. Just, little mini hippie school in the middle of the woods on the coast. And my degree was of my own design and focused on human ecology, basically like how we feed ourselves and how we interact with the rest of the natural world and why over time. Also a little bit about community wellness, but that could be its own presentation. So I'm gonna leave that at that for now. And then after I graduated, I started kind of realizing that I don't actually want to run a farm. It's not really what I want to do. And I was kind of searching around for what my next step was going to be, whether it was in food justice or I thought at one point I might be an environmental journalist. I was really kind of feeling it out, but I moved to Orcas Island, which is next door to the island where I grew up, and was managing a craft cocktail bar where the closest that I came to food justice was sourcing local herbs and fruit, it was cool. But that is when I just kind of happened upon blacksmithing for the first time. I went to a bartering festival on the east side of the state that happens every fall. And there's an artisans row where there are painters and carvers. And there's one smith who comes out every year. And he was kind enough to let me have a hands-on demo little lesson one morning. And I have actually a photo of the very first time that I ever forged anything. A friend of mine just happened to be walking by while I was having that lesson. And so I love hate this photo. It's terrible form, super awkward, but also really awesome because it's clearly within the first couple of heats of the very first thing that I ever got to make. And I walked away with my gnarly, twisted little hook and was oh, something happened. Something's different. I had to pay attention to this. And it took me a number of years, but that was the spark that led me to wind my way here. When I got back home, I contacted a smith on the island who I hadn't met yet. And he was very generous to allow me to come into his studio space. His name is Jorgen Harl. He's actually from Pennsylvania. and he taught me some basics. I was in his studio just on and off over about a year and a half, like pretty infrequently, because I didn't get it together to take advantage of that opportunity. I was too busy running a bar. These are some of the first things that I made. A set of hinges for my friend's small cob home, and a door handle, things like that. And it was at Jorgen's suggestion that I was able to apply for a work study scholarship to go to Penland for a 2-month concentration. I got to work with Andy Donor and Eric Smith for 8 weeks, and it was fantastic. And that was what helped me to decide that, yes, this was something that I wanted to focus on in a more committed way. So that was in the spring of 2015. I made this kelp sculpture, which my mother insisted I ship from North Carolina to Washington. I returned back to Washington, and over the winter was able to use a local blacksmith, Craig Withrow's space, to do a little bit of work in. I did this collaborative piece with my old boss from the place where I made that crab cake. She does a series, she's a ceramic artist, and she does a series of spirit houses, and wanted some nests and ladders made for those. So we did a number of them together, and this was in a show at Chimera Gallery on the island where I grew up, which was great. And I was also able to make some hardware for the kitchen in the house that my parents were building at the time. And that was, we made 50 identical drawer pulls, and I got to fabricate some railings for their deck. I also worked part-time for a friend of mine named Jessie Morrow on Orcas Island, and for her jewelry company, Material Wit, doing production of her brass jewelry. And that was through the summer of 2016, and in the fall of 2016, I reached out through the Northwest Blacksmithing Association's member list and just started cold calling blacksmiths in the Seattle area, asking like, who needs an apprentice? Most of them did not. Alaire Wells of Tinderheart Metals and Designs did. She was really open to that. So I had a working interview, and then ended up moving into her studio and her home in the fall of 2016. And I worked with her as an apprentice for 2 years at Equinox Studios in South Seattle in Georgetown. It's almost a full city block of studios, and it's a really amazing space. And in my time with Alaire, I worked on just a ton of different aspects of her small business. She's an artist blacksmith and a sculptor, and she also does architectural work and just kind of anything. She works in a lot of different mediums, which was great because I got to try out a lot of new things. This was a banister and handrail for a floating home on Lake Union in Seattle. She does iron casting and bronze as well. So I got to work with her on building stands for some of her sculptures, making new products for craft fairs. She was the professor, the metals faculty at Evergreen State College at the time. So we would go down to Olympia, Washington to have bronze pours and blacksmithing classes. I helped her with a show that she had at a local gallery, and we did some performance art. We were really all over the place, and it was great. I also got to develop more of my own work and kind of start feeling out what my own style might begin to be. These are some steel bangles that we've had in the gallery, some hairpins. I'm still playing around with knotting up smaller steel stock. This is a bottle opener, a question mark bottle opener. I got to try my hand at chasing and repoussé for the first time, as well as casting some bronze. And this was the beginning of a series of fruit that is currently still evolving into like a larger project that I'm really excited about, but I'm not gonna include in this presentation. I was also doing printmaking because of course you can't just do one thing at a time. So I started selling little buttons with little printed designs on them. I also formally started my business, Metal Fire Forge. And I got to work with the plasma cutter who was next door to a Lairs workshop called 2K Metalworks, the man named Keith Leggett. This is a huge installation at the University District Food Bank with a piece done by Washington paper artist Niki Mcclure. You can see, if you look at the bike rack in the lower right-hand corner, you can kind of get a feel for how big that is. There's a small door on the very left-hand side. So he taught me about how to use the plasma machine, and I started using the scrap and drop from his projects to make other items like this belt buckle. I did some fabrication for urban reclamations in Soto in Seattle. Made so many chairs for them. And then found my way to Touchstone last summer and spent a great season up in the forge. Worked on making some more of my own tools. These are some chasing tools that I made here last year. Developing more small items like this necklace that I'm really excited about. Making more similar pieces. I got to pop in just one afternoon for a workshop with Troy doing making paintbrushes out of bamboo, and then got to play around with that with steel as well. And got to complete my first lighting project, which was really exciting. This was a series of 4 night lights, and I'm really looking forward to exploring lighting more in a big way in the future. These were made in Ed Parrish's bronze casting class that I got to assist with. They're very small. They're each about 1 inch to 1.5 inches long. This is a bolo tie that I made with Erica's help in small metals as a gift for Grant last summer. It is a hot dog, and it does come out of the bun. These are some ceramic belt buckles that I made in the staff wood firing. And I was really excited to take Kit Paulson's 3-day structural flame working class at the end of the season, where I made this urchin and got to play around with using boro. Ed was really generous with his time as well and taught me about soft glass and boro and some bead making in the glass studio prior to this. But that workshop really did a lot to change my perspective on just materials use, and I'm really excited to be using glass more as well. Right after I left Touchstone, I went to Carey Furnaces for a week-long iron casting class where I did a little bit of sculptural work, and then I cast 4 swage blocks, which is a tool we use in the forge. And this is one like mostly cleaned up. And that was a great experience. And I was able to donate one of those to the Northwest Blacksmithing Association's mentoring center, which I was pretty excited about. And then this winter didn't do much having to do with metal. I was building houses and building a garden for my parents, and I installed a railing with my old mentor in Seattle, and kind of here and there have been getting my hands on metal when I can, which was not often, but I was able to make a set of 37 chasing tools in a little shop on Lopez that used to be a woodworking tool shop. So here they are. This is right after they were tempered and heat treated, so before like their final polish. But it was great. So now I have just a lot more available to be doing more chasing and repoussé on my own. And then I spent a few weeks doing a couple projects for this place called Salish Metalworks on Orcas with their plasma cutter. We cut, it's a long story, but we cut so many sheets of very, very thick, very fancy metal in those 3 weeks where I was working in their shop all by myself because everybody else was at home because of COVID. And it was awesome, and I will probably be returning to work with them in the fall to help expand their business over the winter. And I'm happy to talk more about plasma cutting anytime anybody wants to know about it. And I'm really happy to be here for the summer. I have a lot of things planned, but that could be its own presentation. And yeah, we can talk about that another time. Thanks.
So we have 3 more. These are our newbies, right? Who wants to go first? Taylor Mezo, right? All right. Nice when people volunteer. Okay,
Do you know how to get it so I can still see the speaker's notes?
you'll see them.
Okay, good.
Are you just Touchstone intern? Is that your?
Princess? No,
No.
that's the other Taylor. Sorry. Can't see.
This. Where did I put it? You sent it to me.
Yeah, it
right?
was just called Touchstone Press.
You could try to get it. Maybe I didn't get it. I got Fentz, but I didn't get. You emailed it, right?
Yeah,
Is it on your Google Drive?
yeah,
Do you want to just go there?
yeah. Is it okay?
Okay. All right, just give us a minute here. Do you know your password?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Is it .com?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, it'd be difficult.
No, that's fine.
It's on my phone.
Okay.
Okay. Presenter view, right? Okay. I don't know how to use technology.
Let's just download it. Download.
Right click.
You know how to make this full screen, but you might not see a presenter notes.
That's okay.
Okay. Yeah, you could probably use that too. Yeah.
Where? Here we go.
Good?
Yeah. Thank you. Sorry. Woo! Hey, I'm Taylor. I'm one of the two Taylors here. I'm the ceramics intern. So a little bit about me. I'm from Kankakee, Illinois, which is right where this like red square is. I just graduated with my BFA. I finished classes in December of 2019. So, and I also deinstalled my BFA show 2 days before I came here, which was kind of a crazy thing. Yeah, Governor State. It's pretty nice. If you've ever heard of the Nathan Manilow Sculpture Park, it's also a part of our school, which is interesting. I don't have a lot of my past work to talk about. Most of my work is from like within 2 years because I'm still very early on in my ceramics journey. I completed 2 short-term residencies at Peters Valley and Penland. And then like the world kind of ended with COVID, but I don't know what that means.
This one?
Yeah, that's my presentation.
What were we about there?
No, I was on slide 3.
Still hungry. There's cupcakes still. There's salads, and we have all
I don't know how to do this.
Can we bring it back to the Gmail real quick? Like on Chrome, yeah, you can.
Yes,
I can see the notes.
go out that way on the left. It's just a little tiny places and
I don't want y'all to see that.
offshoot patterns.
Is this, where's the escape? Oh,
Yes.
do you want? Yeah,
I mean, you could do it like that.
yeah,
and you
I'll do
can
it like
see
this
it,
if that's
and then
okay.
just- yeah. That'll work. Okay, want to go from there?
Yeah, that's fine. Is this okay? Or do I need to move that?
Let's keep them up there.
Yeah.
And that
sounds
way you
good.
can, there.
Perfect.
All right.
Okay, sorry for the inconvenience. I like to call myself a functional sculptor because my work really rides the line between functional wear and just pure sculpture pretty hard. My pots are derived from the underlying geometric structures of like natural forms and handmade forms that surround us. And most of them start out as wheel thrown forms. Like for this piece, I threw the base in each of the candle holders, and then they sort of begin to evolve into their own individual pieces through hard slab attachments. I mainly use red earthenware clay because of technical reasons. Like I get fewer cracks and I get less warping with the slab work that I do. I really like red clay. It's just really warm. It's very inviting to me. And I picked up a new clay body on my way here that I'm excited about because it's gonna be like this real rich, leathery, reddish brown, which is kind of what I love about it. I'm not here for white clay, really. I utilize terra sigillata a lot in my work. So I add that when it's bone dry and then I burnish it because it makes the surface of it, you know, softer to the touch. And I like to have unglazed surfaces a lot. So that makes those areas more appealing, not so dry. Most of my work is punctuated with these geometric shapes that I create out of hard slab attachments because I'm always trying to extend the silhouette of a pot. It's I try to approach pots with like a real 2D mindset. I used to be a painter when I first started college. So I always look at the outline and the silhouettes of things. And what interests me is adding these hard slabs to them to sort of extend that silhouette and add different geometric planes to it. So most of my pieces, like within the round, they change pretty dramatically. When I'm making a pot, I think a lot about space and the space that the piece will occupy and how it will affect the space around it. And I want my pieces to not only take up space, but define a space around it. I think a lot about interior design, and I want my pots to embellish home life. I would say that balance is a pretty important part of my work. My zodiac sign is a Libra, and the symbol for that is a scale, which I really relate to. I strive to get like a visual balance as well as a physical balance between pieces. Like this one definitely pushes the physical balance a lot, I think. There's always a balance between void and mass, volume of a form, and like the flat slabs that I would use, glazed and unglazed surfaces. They all kind of work together for me to achieve this like harmony within a piece. For me, clay is about personal growth and bettering myself, as like selfish as that sounds. Clay is really receptive and it's really reactive, and it has allowed me to find a more profound sense of myself. And I like to create pots that are like bold and loud and colorful for times when I can't express that, if that makes sense. Like I'm an introvert, I'm quiet, I'm soft-spoken, but I don't think my pots come off that way. And clay is very, clay allows me to take risks that I don't think I would normally be comfortable with taking myself. It's sort of like this barrier. Pots for me are also less about, you know, the tactility or the utility of a finished piece. I know I'm not creating work that is gonna be your go-to teapot or your go-to mug. I'm creating work that, again, rides that line between function and sculpture. And for me, it's more about exploring the medium and seeing how far I can push it and how much I can explore like the primacy and the perception of form. These are two artists that really inspire me. I'm a big fan of Keith Haring as a queer artist and as an activist. And I also really like Wassily Kandinsky a lot. And I'm a big fan of the Bauhaus. The idea of less is more really like resonates with me. And I look back to them a lot and how they use line and color and shape. And I try to convey that in a 3D sense. This is some jewelry I've been making. I like jewelry a lot. It allows me to work on line, color, and shape on a really small scale that I can use to inform my larger works and stuff. These are some brooches I've been making, and I've been like playing around with brass a lot, back to like Keith Haring and how he would use these bold lines, but instead of it being paint on paper, mine is like a physical brass line that follows the piece. Sometimes I just like to make jewelry because it satisfies a need within me to make something cute. Like, I love hearts. Hearts are such a good decorative tool, I feel like. I'd put hearts on all my pots if I could. And here's some bolo ties I really love. I just love bolo ties. I think they're pretty sweet. It's an accessory that doesn't get enough credit, I don't think. And I remember I have this bolo tie at home that my grandfather wore to my parents' wedding. And it's a ceramic bolo tie too. And just one day I was looking at it and I was like, this is pretty tight. I could make this. So now I also use, when I make bolo ties, it's a way for me to sort of feel that connection to the past too. Even though he didn't necessarily make that bolo tie, it still feels good. This is a series I've been working on lately that I'm gonna definitely work on more while I'm here. I have this idea of making candelabras that are based off of classic cars. And areas of interest are mainly like the tail fins and the headlights and the taillights and the areas around the tires. I made this when I was at Penland in January, and it was really fun. It's a 1959 Chevy Impala. Here's another one. This one is a 1954 Corvette. This piece I started in the studio this week, and it's been fun. I'm trying to break away from the wheel a little bit too. So this one I mainly pinched and coiled. I did throw the little candle stems though. I was looking at, to me, it looks like it has more of like a motorcycle or a bike feel to it, but my reference picture was this Citroen 2CV, a 1964 version. Here's some functional wear that I do. I'm looking forward to making more drinking vessels and seeing how far I can push a drinking vessel so that it's sculptural, but people still want to use it. This martini cup in the corner, particularly, is like my Moby Dick. I've only made like a handful of successful ones. So I'm looking forward to sort of like redesigning it and making it more practical so my loss rate isn't so high. And I'm also looking forward to doing some glaze tests and achieving a surface that sort of melds with my forms more, because that's where I feel like I struggle the most. I'm looking to achieve a more mature surface, because sometimes I look at my pots and I think they seem very childish because of the bold, bright colors and the attachment to like primary colors and stuff. And while I'm here, I'm also looking forward to taking kind of like a deeper dive in myself and my attachment to my pieces. I know what I like aesthetically, but I'm looking forward to discovering why I like what I like. Okay, that's all. Thanks for bearing with me.
Very nice. All right. Al, you want to go next? I have to stop. Start. Is this one yours?
No.
That's Taylor's. Okay, cool. That's nice.
Thank you.
All right, next up we have Elissa, right?
Elle.
Elle Newmeyer.
Yeah. Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Elle. This creature that you see before you is who I am normally, out in the wild. Not really. This is really who I am in my bathroom, in my house, when I'm just feeling a little ornery. I call myself a fartist because there's so much weight that I put into my work that everything else about my life, I like it to be very fun and free and adventurous and very lighthearted. And that's kind of like where this comes from in a lot of ways. So my origin story. I am from Oklahoma, born and raised. My parents were Lisa and Albert Newmeyer. My mom was a dance teacher, and she also worked for, it says federal, but she actually worked for the state HR department. My dad was a photographer, and he also worked for the Air Force. I did have a sister, but unfortunately, my parents lost her in a shopping mall in Grapevine, Texas, about 1997. Of course, I'm kidding. This is my sister, Lindsay. I love her dearly. She's amazing. We've not been friends ever, but I love her dearly. She's a graphic designer and a book illustrator. She's actually graduating this year. She has been in college for 10 years, so it's been a long trek for her. And this is her dog, Isamu. He's the Lincoln log of the house. He is this long. He's about that thick. I love him. This is about 2 miles from my house. So this is just like an open field that I drive past every day, and it looks really great. So I took a picture of it, and I wanted to show you guys how beautiful it is. Because I think when people think Oklahoma, they think of like red dirt, sky, and then nothing. But realistically, it's grass, trees, and sky, and nothing. See here. Okay, so I worked for a tree farm for a couple of years, and I felt really bad about beginning there because I didn't know how to do anything. I killed a bunch of flowers like within 3 or 4 days because I overwatered them immediately. And so they kind of had to take me aside and be like, hey, look, you need to ease up a little bit. You need to like listen to the plants because you're being a little rude. So it took about 6 months on the tree farm from winter into spring. And they taught me how to grow my own fruit and vegetables. So I've got strawberries and, I mean, you can see what it is. But also I found out how to find birds' nests. And the easiest way to find a bird's nest is to go about your business and just start getting attacked. And then you just kind of like scoot closer or farther away from a tree. And the more that they intend on hurting you, the closer you are to that nest. And, but these are both in like pine trees. I think, yeah, or globus spruce, so spruce trees. So these aren't native to Oklahoma. We actually like bust them in from Oregon. And so they're like very particular and they're in our greenhouses. So the birds lay their nests in our greenhouses, which makes our job extremely hard because the rows are really tight and you can't exactly run from the birds. You just kind of have to like hit the ground and hope they stop. The next slide. Okay. So if you see me walking around campus like this, I'm having an amazing day and I'm fully approachable. I'm probably having a lot of fun. I've probably disco danced a bit. I like to go out on the town and do a little gender bending and have a good time. There's this place called Groovies. It's super queer inclusive. And we put on our bell bottoms and our crop tops and our shiny jewelry and we go out there and we just live it up. So a preface before the next slide, the word idiot, I'm gonna use it. What I mean is, it's sort of idiotic how much I care for these people because like to me, it's idiotic to have such a deep connection with somebody that it completely instills the depth of meaning of life to just be around them. So these are my idiots and I love them dearly. And this is also my drag family. So this right here is our mother. This is AJ. And AJ's first child was Lou on the far right there. And then Erin, Bailey would technically be my mother. And then we have Jade and Josiah. And this picture was taken for the Rec Room Idol, which is a young queer inclusive competition that we do. We had to do it all online because of coronavirus this year. But this is us at Frankie's, which is one of the it's probably the only club in Oklahoma City that is kind to young performers. So now that I've talked about me enough in my personal life, this is my glassware. So I started out in the hot shop. It was more like not shop because I hated it. I hated it, I hated it, I hated it. I did it because I always loved glass. I've always been obsessed with it ever since I was a little kid. I looked at it and I just was like mystified by it. And I knew that if I wanted to make the kind of pieces that I was seeing in galleries or in museums, I needed to be in the hot shop to make those pieces. Unfortunately, it just wasn't my gig. And so I took classes with Andy Boatman at Blue Sage. And my last class with him, which is actually the very last time I've ever like been into the studio, he was like, I can see you're not really like feeling this, but we also have like a mini national in the other room. Let me show you how to make a bead. So he showed me a 2-minute tutorial and he said, good luck. And he left the room. I made a bead and I have never looked back and I have never been back in the hot shop. So this is me at 20, just newly 20. I think it was like 3 days after I turned 20. At the time I was working 2 different jobs. I worked as a night auditor and I also worked during the day at a pipe shop. And this is my parents' garage. I had no ventilation, I had no kiln, I had no idea what I was doing, and I did not know any other glass blowers on the torch. So this first year that I had this set up, I was completely isolated, and it was a learning curve for sure. There weren't like Instagram was so new at the time that there weren't any like glass people on Instagram. There weren't any like YouTube tutorials. Revere Glass hadn't put anything out. I didn't even really understand anything about the culture that I was about to like jump into. So during this time, I was privileged enough to incessantly bother this wonderful woman named Tracy Bewley, who, God loving, put up with me. I would show up to her shop every Saturday and say, hey, do you want me to do something? Do you need something? I could just cut clear for you. I could just sit next to you and keep you company. And she was like, please leave me alone and don't come back. So after 3 months, I think, of bothering her, she finally said, okay, if I let you cut this, will you just please leave me alone? I said, yeah, sure. And so she let me cut 3 by 3 inch squares for, I think, about 3 hours the first time. And she was like, wow, I really don't want to do this anymore. So would you like to come in every weekend and just do this for me? I said, yeah, sure, absolutely. And so after a couple months of doing that, I proved to her that I was reliable enough to show up 2 days a week for 6 hours, essentially, and to cut something that she didn't want to do. So she eventually let me start helping her do all this stuff. So these panes right here were a window installation that we made for a client. And these flowers that you see, her husband is a welder, and so he makes stands for them and their garden ornaments to put into your, wherever you want to put them, really, you put them in your house. But they're mainly for your garden. Though I wouldn't put soft glass outside. That's just me. I would run into it or hit it with like a weed whacker, or a rock would get tossed at it. I would run it. Let's see here. Oh, yes. So I had a wonderful, stable job. I had health benefits. I had retirement. I had a 401k. I worked for an amazing company. I met a man and I said, let me go ahead and throw all that away. Let's move into his, what we call the vantion, and travel across the U.S. and learn how to blow glass. He had been blowing glass for a couple of years and wanted to do it. He didn't want to do it alone. I didn't have the courage to even have that thought in my mind at the time. And so he really rallied me into this. My decision, of course, but so essentially we moved to, so we would go for 3 springs and summers. We would travel the lower half of the United States, so coast to coast, about 3 or 4 times during the summer, just working in different studios. Anyone who would accept us, essentially. I would be like, hey, can we rent for $25 a day? Absolutely, just show up. And then we slept in like their parking lots, or we would sleep in like national parks, or 7-Elevens. Pilots are great. TNAs are fabulous. They let you shower and hang out in the movie theater. We did, the first winter, decide that we were gonna go ahead and do the road during the winter time. After almost freezing to death in Colorado for 2 nights in a row that we got stranded in the mountains, we decided to retire this idea and to find a home for the winter. Each winter we would return home to Eureka Springs, Arkansas, which is a really great place if you are above the age of 50. If you are younger than that, good luck having a social life. or any free time, because they will pull you aside and they will immediately tell you their life story, but they will repeat it every time they see you. Also, it was on a mountain, so we lived at the bottom of the mountain, and the top of the mountain was where town was, so you had to walk up a 3% incline every single day to get to town, which was about 30 minutes. It wasn't that bad. I had amazing legs, that's what I'll say. I looked really great in a bathing suit. This is the artist colony that I lived in. I lived over here. It's off, you can't see it. I lived through this like mysterious bamboo forest that they planted, which I told them not to. It ended up breaking up the foundation of our house, whatever. But there was 12 studios altogether. This was built by JD and Kathy something. We just know them as JD and Kathy, so that's what I'll call them. And they built this as like a place for young artists to come and to crash and to make art. Eventually, Dwayne and Adam Blue purchased this, which were the people that I rented from. And they made it like permanent lodging for not glass artists, but just artists in general. So everybody in these studios were different kinds of artists. But what I found out really quickly is that when 13 people share one bathroom, one toilet, one shower, it's not a great situation, and that you have to bucket sometimes. So during the summers, we would go off and learn from different people. I learned how to do hollow implosion work. So there's solid and hollow. I already knew solid, but hollow was like the big thing to learn, because it's actually, for me personally, it was very difficult. And then I also learned how to do sculpting, which was something I was really interested in. And a lot of people that I was working around were not interested in, because they were more tube oriented and couldn't see past hollow walls. So solid stuff was definitely interesting for me, at least, to be a part of. So after me and my partner split up and I decided to move away from Arkansas, I moved straight to Oregon, and I worked for a company called Dichroic Alchemy. I learned how to pull dichroic tubes and to turn those into pipes for their production facility. I had never worked with dichro before, and it's a massive learning curve, especially if no one teaches you on your first day of the job. So I blew up a couple tubes day one, and then I had to learn how to repair them and then reuse them and then sell them, which was really fun. But from that, I learned how to do this, which is all of this stuff you see here. This is all broken from a tube that I have popped. So this is all scrap turned into something else. This is a pipe. I still have this pipe. It is special to me because of the person who made the cabochon on the top of that, but I did the rest of it. I kind of like to do multimedia stands for my stuff, so it's got like moss and whatnot on it. So like a wooden blank from Michael's. This piece is a bug pipe as well. It's very small, but it's like super cute. It resides in London, UK right now. I illegally shipped a pipe across seas, that's against federal law, so just in case you're curious. So after I left Oregon, there was compounding things that ended up pretty much obliterating me as an entire human being. So this is actually me driving on the way home from Oregon to Oklahoma. My parents graciously accepted me back into their home and said, oh my God, please come back and just like learn how to be a person again. So for a year, from February of 2018 until December of 2018, I had to relearn how to eat and put my clothes on and brush my teeth and tie my shoes and talk in general. And so that was a really difficult time for me. I didn't blow a lot of glass, but I decided to invest in this thing called therapy and to talk about my problems and to work through them and make my life better for myself and not for anyone else. During December, I lost someone who was my best friend. Not a literal best friend, but a family member who I could never replace the relationship with anybody else who will ever exist. And her name was Norma Lee. She was my aunt. Technically, she's my great aunt. And we had a fantastic relationship. She pretty much taught me how to spit and hit and shoot and run around and be mischievous. And This is her memoriam piece. It used to swivel, like all those pieces were not connected. They used to turn independently. And then I dropped it and I had to repair it. And instead of going through all the work of making it swivel again, I just decided to anchor it so that I didn't have to do that. It was very difficult. It was such a crazy learning curve. Anyway, this piece is what eventually got me into Pinland, which was, I applied for Pinland for 3 years. I had never gotten anything back on it. But finally they said, we have room, come out and see us, let's do something about it. Carmen Lozar's class changed my entire perception on artwork. She taught me how, it was a sculpting class, so she taught me how to make those hands. She essentially saw the project that I wanted to make, and she backed away and said, you are obviously on a mission, I'm gonna let you do what you wanna do. You know, please go to bed sometime. So I did this in a week. I would never advise anyone to do that ever. It's terrible. I literally, during this show, I was upstairs asleep on a couch while everybody else was like taking my card and asking where I was. But yeah, she essentially, her and Jeff Heathbar, which was her teaching assistant, reminded me that it is okay to work through your emotions in your art, and that it's not to woo to have that relationship with your work. So this is that corresponding me. This is just a series that I made, and if I say that I can't talk about work, I'm not being rude and I'm not trying to be put offish. It just means that I haven't worked through it enough in therapy to speak to you about it. So that's what this is. And this is, I made this 2 months ago. It's called Becoming. And then this one over here is Joy Desperate from a silly web series that I watched. But this is just me refining those techniques, taking 2D, making that 3D in multimedia work. And this is a 2-dimensional piece that's a pendant. It's about 4 inches big. It's a little too big to be a pendant. And of course, I know you guys, I've told you guys I'm not a bead lady. I am a bead lady through and through. So I just like bigger beads. 3 inches are about what I like to wear, which is a little bit too big, a little too heavy, but you know, you get through it. And this is progression. So this is the end of my slide, but also this is 40 hours on the torch, and this is last year when I hit 10,000 hours. So this is the difference that it makes, and this is what I show people whenever they come to me and they tell me that they can't make glass and that they're not good at it and that they're failing. And I say, look, as long as you put the time into it, you will do amazing. So, and that's it, guys.
All right, we got one more, right? Unless Colleen, you have something prepared. Taylor Fentz, right? Oops. Okay.
Hello, my name is Taylor Fentz. I went to undergrad at Ball State University and studied under first Pat Nelson, but just for 1 semester. Although I love her, I didn't get too much instruction from her before she retired. And then Jessica Calderwood was my professor for the duration. And she's just, I can't talk enough about her as a professor. I feel very, very lucky to have gotten the education I did under her.
Excuse me, Taylor, can you move into the,
oh,
yeah, so the people can
And I'm currently at the grad program at Edinburgh University studying under Sua Mindalora and Kathy Cunard. So I make a lot of work, so it's often challenging for me to kind of pick what needs to be, you know, seen, talked about, and what doesn't. So there's a lot of work on here, but this is just I guess my production jewelry started about 2 years ago. And I put it up there because I think it's a good starting point of where I was at in undergrad. I really liked stones, I liked sparkly things, I liked geodes a lot. And I loved jewelry and making jewelry. And I was just kind of inching my way into thinking about what I was making conceptually and the language I was using. So yeah, I was putting a lot of stones in things, and then I kind of had to question, like you do when you're in a university that has you question concept. Why am I doing what I'm doing, and what is it about stones that I just feel like they need to be in everything? So yeah, I kind of started to realize that I liked this feeling of capturing this thing that was precious, right? And then looking at the way I was capturing them as a language. So there's this philosophical kind of notion, and it goes kind of like, we don't understand anything until, we only understand things through understanding what they are not. So we understand through comparison, essentially. And so I typically love contrast for this reason, and not necessarily contrast that comes together in a cohesive way. More often contrast that takes two opposing things and sets them apart. And I find that there's some sort of inherent truth in that. At the same time, I was thinking a lot about humanity as a species, our place in the world, what we are in opposition to all other, and then this, on the other hand, this ever-evolving notion of nature and natural. And I was really struggling with, okay, how are those connecting? What are their relationship to each other? And how can I understand one through understanding the other? So I guess a little bit back, I was continuing thinking about interacting with these things that I wanted to wear and how I wanted to set them. So I took the geodes out, you know, those weren't inherently important, and I started just making open concept containers to be worn, and then the wearer can choose what goes in them. And then also looking about that curiosity that comes with collecting and wanting to wear things. And so the stone itself is just some pebble I found, but then when you put it under a magnifying glass, the focus becomes the curiosity and looking closer, and it becomes a lot more interesting. This is a container necklace that when, to put it on, you have to open the cage, and to take it off, you have to open the cage. So you might be collecting something, but then in order to take this necklace off, you have to let what you've collected out. So I was kind of thinking about the some of the psychological aspects that go into collecting, maybe like hoarding and having to let go of this thing that you're attached to before you can take this piece off. And then this one is a personal locket, so only the viewer has this special perspective of looking at it under a magnifying glass. This is a piece called Domestication I made for a gallery traveling show that Heidi Lowe Gallery put on. It was called Front of the House, Back of the House. So she left it open to the artist. Well, first off, Front of the House, Back of the House had to do, it was inspired by a book, Front of the House, Back of the House Kitchen, and how those two worlds look completely different. And so she wanted the artist to kind of think about duality and polarity in their own way and what they were interested in. So if I'm not kind of letting creativity just flow naturally in the studio, I often get a lot of my inspirations from books or articles I'm reading. So I was listening to a book on audio called Sapiens, which is just totally fantastic. And if you're interested in anthropology and humanity, I suggest the book. And so there was this part in there where they were talking about the domestication of food sources and how that, you know, from that point on, our humans completely changed as a species. I mean, as every turning point, but that was one big one. And he questioned in there, and I love that flip in my mind. He questioned, you know, do we domesticate wheat or do we domesticate us? Because as soon as we domesticated wheat, our lives completely changed and we could no longer travel. We were no longer nomadic, and it changed everything. So something I'll point out just real quick, specifically on this piece, is the brooch component. So that was kind of my back of the house, was that this domesticated thing was locked into us. So I made kind of a deadbolt lock that you'd find on a barn house. Okay, so there was a point in my life where my partner at the time was working in oil refineries as an industrial repeller. And it was odd because up until that point, and still currently for me personally, I'm concerned about the environment. I'm concerned about humans' impact on the environment and how we're interacting with it and what we're going to leave behind. And this is a photo from the refinery that he was working at one point. He also worked at a huge one in Texas. And I was just always seeing these images, and they were horrible. They looked like hell, literally. And he would always be coming home on the weekends and showing me these pictures and talking about how, you know, dead birds are all over the place, and you know, someone almost fell today and died, and you know, the impact that on the environment is just disturbing. And at the time, once I graduated undergrad, we were going to move to Whiting, Indiana. And I'd be living right next to this. Whiting, Indiana is where all of the refinery workers live, and the town is maybe a third of the entire refinery. So you can see more of the refinery than you can see your own backyard or your neighbors. And it really encompasses everything. When you're going into Whiting, Indiana, there's this drawbridge, and it's like you're driving into a post-apocalyptic dystopian hell. And I was mentally preparing for that, and thinking a lot about it. I started, you know, thinking, okay, well, if I'm going to live in some outrageous place like this, maybe at least I can get some inspiration for my work out of it. And it does, you know, it has to do with a lot with understanding an aspect of humans on the planet today. These earrings, though, in particular, had more to do with my personal guilt of being, we weren't married, because I didn't want my debt to transfer over to him. But, you know, as far as I was concerned, we were married. We were going to live together. We've been together for 6 years. And there was this culture in the people who worked with my partner. They all had wives or girlfriends that were like stay-at-home wives or girlfriends, and they all had like creative hobbies, and they all had some, you know, stipend from their husband, and kind of really benefited from that money coming out of their husbands working here. And there's something just that rubbed me the wrong way about. I was a part of it. I felt completely a part of it. It felt like we were all in the exact same boat, and I didn't like that at all. I didn't like BP. I didn't like the oil refinery. I didn't like this aspect of humanity, even though I loved making work about it because I think it's important and interesting. I didn't like being so close to it and truly benefiting from it. And so it just made me feel gross. So I made these pearl pipeline earrings because I felt like this housewife of the oil refinery. And so, yeah, I was just making a lot of pipelines. I was kind of preparing myself to make the work that I'd be making when I moved there. So pipelines coming out of my ears, literally. The earrings on the very end there, the post goes through your ear, and when they're pressed up, it looks like the pipe is running through your ear. So, yeah, that work stopped when my partner and I split. But I think it was very important turning point because it was the start of me looking at my work or gaining inspiration from site-specific, in a site-specific way. So I was planning to really dig into that site and make work from it. And that was different than I'd ever thought about my work before. And it really interested me. And I was I felt like I had lost that opportunity because there was no way I was gonna move there if we weren't together anymore. And I was like, I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do, but I knew I loved education, and I applied to grad school, and I went there, and I told Kathy and Sue that even though I'm not going to be living in the refinery so close and really immersed in it, that I still wanted to do, to travel to sites like the refinery that were interacting with the environment in an odd way or a unique and interesting way. So I kind of was just keeping my eye out for sites around Pennsylvania that interested me in that same way. And this is my boyfriend. We started dating about 8 months ago. And he's just awesome. He travels with me to all these places because I don't like going to these places alone. Some of them are a little creepy and dangerous. And yeah, so he's a great partner. But so we were just traveling around on vacation and came across this place called Centralia in Pennsylvania. And Centralia, I don't even know if it's actually considered a town anymore. It was a town. And what had happened was, I think, I want to say 30 years ago, and this was like a mining town. So similar to Whiting, Indiana, there was a mine close by, and everyone who lived in the town either worked there or benefited from it in some way. And that was where the economy was coming from. And so what had happened was, accidentally, a fire was started in the mine underground, and it started burning, and it hasn't stopped. It's still burning today. And there's smoke rising up from the ground, and it's completely eaten away at the infrastructure under the ground and creates these huge fissures on the earth. This is a stretch of highway that was a main stretch of highway. They had to cap it off and condemn it. Like all of Centralia, it's dangerous. I guess at any point, if you step wrong or off the wrong way, it might be weak in the ground, and big sinkholes can be created. And the whole town had to move out. And yeah, it was just odd. It was a really strange place visiting there. These are just two pictures. So I had no idea how I wanted to make art from these places. I just knew that they were interesting to me. So I grabbed a bunch of trash bags while we were there. We were supposed to be on vacation, but then it turned into like a work site. And he's super interested. He went to university for ecology for a bit, so he just thought that this was super cool anyway, and he was just having fun. So I took a bunch of trash bags and just started collecting materials and photographing everything. And then I took that back home and I photographed the materials. I laid them all out just to have some different perspective and understanding of them. And I started orienting the materials and cutting them up and using them to make little miniature maquette sculptures. And I guess, well, while I was there, I was looking at all these different materials, and the lines began to blur between what was man-made and what was natural. And it was super surreal and uncanny. And I wanted to try to get that across a bit. So I consider these explorations, and they're not finished. Some of them might be finished, like the purple stone there, I want to turn into a brooch, and that's almost done. But what was interesting, I think, to people who saw these when I was finished, was that the stuff that looks like grass is pieces of rusted steel. And the purple stone is actually molded, or molten plastic. It had just been melted into the ground and collected gravel. The branches that are painted blue were spray painted, and I just collect them. So I was looking while I was there with an uncanny eye, and then trying to take these alternative materials I collected there and paint an uncanny picture of my experience there. And I was a huge jumping off point for me. And I thought, I got to do this again. Like, I only have so many materials. I'd only spent so much time there, but I want to jump on to the next site, and I want to do it again and keep going. So we did it again. And then over spring break, I did a crap ton of research, and there was a visiting artist we had a few weeks before spring break that said, hey, have you ever heard of Superfund sites? And I was like, no. And so I got on the EPA's website, and there's just hundreds of Superfund sites all over the United States. A Superfund site is a site in which something, generally human activity, has caused an environmental impact that is hazardous and dangerous to the point that the EPA has to step in, shut it down, and start cleanup. So this was one in, oh my goodness, I forget the town, but it was in West Virginia. And it was a glass and zinc factory. And it was very hazardous. There was arsenic and lead and asbestos all throughout. And so I was pretty nervous, but we kind of like suited up as best we could and wore gloves the entire time we were there, and put all of the clothes we were wearing afterwards in the back of the car and showered when we got to the hotel. And yeah, I had to kind of like rope my way down into this site. We are not necessarily there legally. We kind of have to break into. I probably don't have to break into. There's phone numbers I need to be calling, but I get a little excited, and then like last minute, I'm like, we have time to go to a site, and then we just go there. But I'm gonna start calling there's like people who manage the sites that I'm sure if I was like, hey, I'm an artist and this is for research, and they'd probably be just fine with it. So I should start doing that. But so yeah, we took a bunch of pictures, did the same thing like we did at Centralia, collected a bunch of materials. These places are just outrageous. They're really crazy. They're always dump sites. So a lot of what we're finding is garbage and discarded belongings from residents, or I don't know, they become dump sites, unfortunately. And yeah, I photographed a bunch of what we found there. We found so many dead animals, which was concerning, because it didn't seem, it's not likely that they were all from hunting. It's more likely that they had been poisoned by eating something in the area. This was interesting. There were areas of concrete that looked like some disease was seeping through them. I always said that it looked like the concrete was diseased, and it was bizarre to me. I collected some of what that was, and I did some research and found out that it's a man-made stalactite. I'm gonna butcher the name, but it's something like calthemite. Not calcite, it's calthemite. And it's calcium based. And it happens from acid rain seeping through the concrete and dissolving and picking up the calcium rich substrate in the concrete, and then these are formed. And I guess they form really fast. And one of my projects here is I'm gonna order some carbonic acid, which is the acid found in the rain, and see if I can't form these myself, and then maybe even form them into specific shapes. I don't know. It's a lot of exploration right now. Yeah, a lot of different steel, metal, rusty parts. Thought this was odd. There's a lot of like moss that was growing on some of this, you know, otherwise these materials that had come from a toxic place, like nature kind of overcoming and continuing. Some glass, some of that. Unfortunately, a lot of these materials are either really difficult to work with without a huge variety of tools, which I think while I'm here, I do have access here to a lot more tools than I do in my home studio, but they're also very toxic. So I'm at kind of like a standstill with how to deal with this site in particular. I have some problem solving to do. And this is just some material exploration. I'm trying to inlay plastic in different materials. I read an article about how, you know, little tiny plastic particles are, you know, seeping into just about every aspect of our lives, and we can find them in our stomachs, and that's really creepy and gross. And so I was trying to inlay plastic in different materials to kind of talk about the invasive nature of that material. Yeah, just orienting these materials. Like I said, I'm at a standstill because some of these are either too, like, very difficult to work with, or I don't know what they are, or I do know what they are and they're toxic. So I got some research still to do on all that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you guys for sharing your work. In this past week, we've only done the presentations for the end. And it's always a shame that we didn't get to know each other's work ahead of time, because it gives you such a different perspective on the individual. And so it's exciting to see the work, and then to be able to offer you guys to show some work again towards the end of your time here, so that you can see, you know, what you have dove into and explored, and how the time here has informed your practice. So we really appreciate it. We had a couple board members who were watching via Zoom, and also I don't know if you met Mary Lynn, probably, and Linda, who are also on our board. But I think we'll all be looking forward to your next presentation to see what you've been working on. Thank you. And always good to re-see your presentation, Dan. I get something different out of it every time. And I never get tired of that first picture.
Did I use that before?
Yeah.
Yeah.